You're now listening to the Engage the Rockies podcast, your go-to podcast for local and state issues concerning Colorado.
Hello, Colorado. This is the Engage the Rockies podcast. I am your host, Jarvis Caldwell, Executive Director of Engage the Rockies. So this episode, we're going to do an analysis, you could say, on some of the more interesting races from the 2024 primary election here in Colorado. We wanted to bring you this a little bit earlier, but maybe the Monday after. But usually in this world, in the political world, as soon as an election ends, everybody involved in it disappears for a couple of weeks. That was the case here. And so we're glad that everybody's starting to come back here. And today's episode, our special guest is Mr. Tyler Sandberg. Tyler is the principal at Timor Strategies. He's the former vice president and co-founder of the education reform advocacy group, Ready Colorado. Tyler also ran former Republican U.S. Rep. Mike Kaufman's 2018 and 2014 election campaigns, and he served as Kaufman's deputy chief of staff in 2015. Tyler, thanks so much for joining us here today.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Okay, Tyler, so we'll jump right into this. I just want to do big picture. What is your headline? What's the big takeaway from overall of how the 2024 primary elections went here in Colorado?
Sure. Voters stomped on the far left and the far right. They rejected extremism thoroughly, not by a few points, but by 2-1 margins in very Democratic districts, in very Republican districts, in northern Colorado, southern Colorado, Denver. Every corner of the state, extremists were stomped on by voters. Voters thoroughly rejected the far left and the far right in a very refreshing fashion. And this wasn't about conservative versus liberal, conservative versus moderate, liberal versus moderate. This was the far right versus mainstream conservatives and the far left versus more mainstream Democrats. But it was a through line across the dial on election night.
Yeah, and just to kind of expand on that a little bit, and just for people who are listening who maybe aren't as dialed in on kind of the inner party politics and stuff like that. So when we talk about and we're going to talk about some of these races here in a minute, but when we're saying your far, let's say far left candidates and things like that, and we'll get to those races first here in a second. But basically what we're saying, what you're saying is probably the kind of the very staunch pro-Palestine, left-wing people, or maybe the defund the police type people like that. Those are the people that what you would consider maybe more traditional Democrat or moderate Democrat. The election results basically show people like that winning. And on the far right, when we're kind of talking about that, probably the more, 2020 election focused candidates, maybe
conspiracy theorists, people who are just angry to be angry. And on the left, it's very clear. It's basically DSA, Democratic Socialists of America. It's their rank and file members. They endorse in these races. They spend hundreds of thousands of dollars in these races. On the right, it's less clear. For me, it was more a question of character than it was ideology, because the candidates that won were deeply conservative in many parts of the state. It wasn't moderates that were winning. It was mainstream conservatives who are very much for a limited government, a strong national defense, traditional family values, things like that. But they were not people who were often very deeply flawed character-wise, people with incredibly insane criminal arrest records, hundreds of thousands of dollars in unpaid taxes, debts to small businesses. So for me, it was a character question oftentimes, or a behavior question for certain incumbents on the right. And the left, it was much more defined by DSA versus kind of what a Democratic friend called normie Dems.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And, I'm glad you make that distinction there, because I've had this conversation with people too, which is another race we'll talk about is Gabe Evans, and it's I've had people say, well, he's the more moderate conservative. And I'm I worked with Gabe Evans at the Capitol when I was the comms director up there. Gabe Evans I would not consider a moderate conservative or a moderate Republican. I mean, he's very conservative. If you consider what is a very conservative person, he matches all those requirements. But what you're saying basically is he's probably the more reasonable Republican, right? And it's because you're talking about character, right? So he's somebody you can talk to. He's somebody who will work across the aisle when you need to work across the aisle, right, for bipartisanship. And basically the other candidates who largely lost are people who just weren't willing to work across the aisle. It was just they took their stance on issues, and it was like, I'm not gonna budge on anything. Is
No,
that kind of what you're getting at?
and fascinatingly and very sadly, the candidates that lost were broadly defined by those that were endorsed by the Colorado Republican Party, which has never been this kind of wacko, frankly corrupt as it is this time around. But 14 of the 18 candidates that were endorsed by the Colorado Republican Party, first in modern history. Normally the party is neutral by definition in primaries. 14 of the 18 endorsees lost. And these are folks, who wanted to go shout and scream, didn't actually care about creating good policy. Because when you're in the minority, good policy, you don't have the numbers to pass your own bills. You don't have the numbers to defeat bad bills. But you can be strategic and think about ways to water down bad provisions, to add on amendments, to work and build coalitions with Democrats that are willing to cross their own party. And the folks that were running that lost were refusing to engage in the adult game of politics. It's called politics is a game of addition, and these folks just want to jump up and down and make hissy fits. And voters said, no, we have real problems in the state. We want problem solvers. We don't want temper tantrums.
Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, let's jump right into the races here. As I alluded to already, so I think maybe the races that really it had national attention. I saw national articles about these two races in particular, and it's what you were getting at there just a minute ago, which is the far left candidates. So we have Tim Hernandez versus Cecilia Espinoza. This one was actually fairly close, and just for the audience to know, I rounded up some of these numbers. So if, let's say, somebody had 38.8%, I just rounded it up to 39, just for clarification here. So Tim Hernandez was around 47%, Cecilia Espinoza 53%. So that was a 6-point margin. And then you had Elizabeth Epps from House District 6, sitting representative, versus Sean Camacho, again, the normie Democrat, I guess you could say. Epps got 39%, roughly 39%, to Camacho's 61%. So if you kind of want to expand on that, maybe talk about those people in particular. Tim Hernandez, appointed, never actually went through the election process. Go ahead and take it from here.
Absolutely, and it's a good segue because speaking of temper tantrums, Elizabeth Epps was the queen of temper tantrums and actually had to get admonished by her own party when the only Jewish Republican, Ron Weinberg, Representative Weinberg from Loveland, was speaking about Israel-Palestine issue because it was part of an amendment that the Epps had brought up to ensure that food programs for low-income kids couldn't buy products from Israel, which is not a way to treat low-income kids in Colorado. You feed them the food that's affordable and nutritious if taxpayers are funding it. She added amendments. There was discussion on the House floor about Israel-Palestine, and Representative Weinberg, who is Jewish, was talking about his grandparents and the Holocaust. And she's sitting in the galley with a bunch of pro-Palestinian protesters screaming at him, trying to shout him down, literally throwing a temper tantrum. And voters don't want that. One, the State House of Representatives is not the place to be debating international policy. They have no impact. So it was inappropriate for Epps to bring up the amendment in the first place. And second of all, people don't want people who are going to just shout and scream and stamp their foot. I mean, everyone's been around toddlers. We don't want toddlers making our laws. And so Epps was thoroughly rejected. I mean, that is almost a 2-to-1 drubbing in that race. And that is a resounding rejection of Epps and her politics of grievance, her politics of look at me, not I'm here to solve problems, but I'm here to get attention for myself. And voters are getting really tired of that because the problems in our state, in our country, are piling up. And they're serious problems that families are facing every day. And they don't want the people that they hire to solve those problems to be more about themselves and the families they represent. So that to me was a very clear repudiation of her politics. But in both districts, there are large Jewish populations. So I think underlying to those two races is that Jewish voters roared. They were really tired of the anti-Semitism. You can have concerns about how Israel is conducting its war, but that's not what Hernandez and Epps were doing. They were out and out pro-Hamas. On the day of the attack on October 7, 2023, then Representative Hernandez, thank God he's no longer that, or soon to be no longer that, he was literally retweeting tweets celebrating the murder and rape of Israeli kids, celebrating the humiliation of Israel. And that is simply too far, even for a very, very far left-wing district. That is perhaps the most liberal, most democratic district in the entire state of all 65 state house districts. Even that was beyond the pale for the most left of voters. They could not stand that. So they rejected him by 6 points, a smaller margin, but in the game of politics, there is no second place. There's no runner-up. And he has thankfully been bounced from office. And both of those is really important that it wasn't one party kind of getting rid of their extremists. Both parties did that. Voters really thoroughly rejected extremism on both sides. But those are two that I think really encapsulated what Democratic voters did to their own extremes.
Yeah, and it's actually a really good segue into the next race we're going to talk about here, which I mean I think the theme there is making headlines and having your name constantly in the news for all the wrong reasons doesn't benefit you come election time, because people get tired of it, right? They get tired of seeing the negative headlines, and you're making the news for the wrong reasons. And the reason I say that's a segue, because the next race that I want to talk about, I want to get to the congressional races. And this race, we have CD5, Jeff Crank versus Dave Williams. Dave Williams, the state party chairman, I would say very controversial, and made a lot of headlines, I think for mostly negative reasons. So Jeff Crank won that pretty overwhelmingly, 65% to 35%, almost 2-1. And so, what was your overall take on that one?
I think it was best put by the 2020 Trump regional political director for the Southwest, West and Southwest, Brian Seichik, who told the Colorado Sun about Dave Williams' 2-1 drubbing that voters had rightly identified his raging moral turpitude. They're really tired of Dave Williams' self-righteous corruption. I mean, he is truly one of the most loathsome figures in all of Colorado politics, and voters were loath to see him ascend to power. I mean, he has never actually won a competitive race his entire life. He's been around, but he won via the assembly process when he was in the state house. So at most, a few dozen activists showed up and supported him, but never won a primary. He ran against Congressman Lamborn in 2022 and got, I believe, about 29% of the vote, barely less than he did this time when it was a head-to-head race. I think that was a 5-way race against an incumbent. So voters really thoroughly rejected Dave Williams. He was corruptly using state party money, not only using state party to endorse him and his cronies, but he was using money raised to beat Democrats to attack other Republicans like Jeff Crank and boost himself. And voters, elected officials, everyone was very tired of the out-and-out corruption. They wanted someone that's going to go to Congress and work for them. I mean, 50% of jobs in El Paso County are tied to the federal government in some way, either through the military, through aerospace, defense contracting. It is a place that really relies on having an effective voice in Washington to have strong military policy, to make sure Space Command stays in Colorado Springs, to make sure that we're investing in aerospace and cutting edge technology that's being developed, and cyber issues that are being trained at UCCS, that are being engaged in through military bases down there, through contractors down in the Springs. The area that really relies on having an effective voice in Washington, and they correctly identified that Dave Williams would be a voice for himself and not the voters, whereas Jeff Crank would go and fight for the families, the businesses, and the communities within the 5th Congressional District. Dave Williams was out for himself and himself alone, and that drubbing was unbelievable. I mean, he got beaten like a rented mule.
Yeah, because I've followed Dave Williams over the last few years, and I watched the CD5 debates, and I noticed that Dave had this like more cool and calm and collective demeanor that it wasn't typical of him when you would see him at rallies or things like that, or at state party assemblies and things. He was kind of more of a I would say like a Lauren Boebert. He could really rile the crowd up and get the cheers and stuff. But I noticed when he was actually doing the debates and things like that, he tried to be more cool, calm, and collected. But at the same time, on the other side of it, running as the party or running the party as the chair, he was kind of doing the thing with the sending the email, the God hates flags, and making national controversy that way. And it's like running for the seat that's been held by Doug Lamborn, who again, I wouldn't call him a moderate Republican. He's very conservative. At the same time, he's just quieter, not making headlines all the time for whatever reasons, as far as good reasons or bad reasons, a little bit more under the radar, but very big in the military world. And so, I don't know what Dave Williams' thinking was as far as this is a good strategy to win this district, him doing all the stuff that he was doing on the state party side. It was like, do you realize what district you're running for and who represented it for 19 years? You're completely opposite. So odd tactic to me. And then also, I think it was the first CD5 debate with Dave, between Dave and Jeff. There was this moment where they were talking about abortion in Colorado, and Dave said, he talked about removing Space Command or not bringing Space Command here because of the abortion laws in Colorado. And I thought, well, that's a very interesting position to take, considering how dependent the Colorado Springs economy is on the military and DOD contracts and things like that. And it's like, I didn't hear him take the stance, well, we should close down the Air Force Academy too because of abortion in Colorado. So, I don't know if you have any takes on that, but I just thought it was
two things.
Strategy.
I think it's an important point. The first thing I would say is that he was the first candidate in the entire 2024 election cycle to lose Trump's endorsement. So his loss is not just embarrassing; it is truly stunning in its thoroughness with the Trump endorsement. And the number two is when I talk to national reporters and I try to explain to them the kind of unique politics of Colorado, how voters are. I say we love guns, God, gays, and ganja, but not government. We're a small L libertarian state, and even in the Republican Party, we do not like hatred. There are people who may have different feelings on different gay rights issues, but they don't believe in hatred. They don't believe in anger, or at least it's a very, very small segment that actually believes that's an acceptable way to behave. It's love your brother, and so Dave's anger and his aping of the Westboro Baptist Church and God hates flags, I think was just so ugly, and it really put an ugly face on a position that is not widely held. And then with the Trump endorsement, I think he was just cocky. I think he thought that all press was good press, because for Trump that often is the case. Trump is also a very, very different beast than Dave Williams, and Dave never seemed to get that. He thought he was a mini Trump, and there's no Trump but Trump, I think is what most politicians have to realize. And the anger just doesn't work. We've had one Republican governor in the last 60 years. Why? Because too often our gubernatorial candidates run angry, and angry has never worked in Colorado. Colorado wants a happy warrior. Think Heidi Ganahl 2016, Cory Gardner 2014, Bill Owens 98 in 2002. These are Republican statewide victories that are happy warriors, people that are optimistic, that are inclusive, that talk about governing for all with conservative values. Dave running an angry, reductive campaign got an angry, reductive electorate to throw him out. I mean, this just did not work, and I hope it's a signal to other politicians that anger and hatred are not effective political tactics and should be jettisoned. And if you're angry, don't run for office. We want hopeful, optimistic people that are going to lead us to a better day, not people who are going to rail about the past or rail about attacking this population or that. It's about governing for all Coloradans.
Yeah, that's a great point. Okay, moving on. Lauren Boebert, Congressional District 4. This was a 6-way race. Lauren won overwhelmingly, 43% of the vote in a 6-way race. Jerry Sonnenberg got second place, and he only had 14%. So, I mean, this was just really kind of overwhelming as far as that goes. However, as you and I had talked about the other day, an interesting point is that 43% is not even half of the vote. So if this was a 1v1 race, it would have went likely, depending on who that other one person was, likely Lauren may have actually lost this if it was one-on-one. What's your take on that, especially considering, she's running in a district that she hadn't held before. She was in CD3. So, yeah, I'd love your take on that one.
It's a great kind of political science example of the textbooks in that name ID matters a lot. And voters in Colorado have a lot of elections. I mean, we have partisan primaries for coroner. Voters have a lot of fatigue of having to ask and analyze, multiple candidate fields up and down the ballot. And for Douglas County voters, which is about 50% of CD4, they had a competitive new judicial district, so a new DA race. They had a competitive county commissioner race. They had a competitive state senate, state house. I mean, they are inundated with races. And you had one candidate, Lauren Boebert, who had near universal name ID and $1.5 million in the bank, versus their opponents who had essentially pennies to rub together at best with no name ID. And it takes time and money to create name ID. Lauren had both, her opponents had neither. And so at the end of the day, she won going away. The question becomes, what would happen in a two-way race? Because I would venture to guess that the second choice of a bunch of those other 5 candidates was probably Lauren Boebert and not one of the other 5. And so she wouldn't necessarily be stuck at that 43 in a head-to-head, but it would have been a very different dynamic. I mean, Lauren didn't really have to defend her record. She basically got to sit back and rely on the money she'd already raised for CD3 that she transferred over and just continue getting news for stuff in Congress, for her campaigning, good, bad, and different. All press was good press for creating name ID in a way that in a 5-way race, 6-way race, that's all that mattered. And this is a big lesson to candidates that, Lauren is well known, but the rest of them were politicians. They were the House Minority Leader. They were a longtime state senator and state rep. These were people who had been on the ballot before, but pretty far down ballot, and voters just didn't know who they were, and they did know who Boebert was. And one of the reasons is The 3rd congressional district where Boebert had represented for the past 4 years, 70% of that is in the Denver media market. So the Denver media market was already getting lots and lots of coverage of her because of CD3, and CD4 is almost all in the Denver media market too. So people knew her. It wasn't like she was in a different media market. She was in a different district, but it was the same TV stations, some similar newspapers, same radio stations. So she was well-known quantity to folks in the Front Range.
Yeah, and I mean, you brought up a really good point at the beginning there, which is, no idea how it would go if it was one-on-one, but it's a very good point that you made, which is she very well may be the number 2 pick for some of those people. So, if you're a Deborah Flora voter, and she was your number 1, if for some reason she dropped out, it's very possible that Lauren Boebert was your number 2, and then Lauren would have got those votes too. So it's very possible if it was only, let's say, since he got 2nd place, Jerry Sonnenberg and Lauren Boebert, Lauren would have still got a whole bunch of those other votes because all the people, not all, but a lot of people who are going to vote for Deborah or, I don't know, Peter Yu or something like that may have came over to Lauren instead of like.
But it would have been a different environment too, because a lot of money would have come in on a head-to-head race. There was no outside money spent, and outside money is the mother's milk now of politics because of low contribution limits. I mean, Congress you can raise considerably more than the state house, but you're still limited to, I believe it's like 2,800, maybe it's 3,200 per person. It's a relatively small amount where you can spend unlimited amounts from a single donor on a super PAC, and money would have come in on a head-to-head race. Money would have come in probably to back Sonnenberg if he was head-to-head. So it's kind of like we'll never know. But maybe Boebert will be challenged in 26. We'll see what happens. And we may have a different election system then. If some ballot initiative 310 that's going to be on the ballot passes. But at this point, Boebert won, I think, strength on name ID. And the rest of them, they couldn't decide amongst themselves. There were, what I understand, some conversations privately to do a poll and have them all drop out, and the one that did best against Boebert stay in the race. But trying to get very ambitious politicians to stand down is a fool's errand most of the time.
Yeah. Well, especially considering like 2 of the representatives in that race, they're state representatives, and it's like once you jump in the race, well, you just lost your state representative seat, so you're kind of going all in, right? Because it's like, well, I'm not gonna jump in and then I lose my state representative race, or I lose that position now. So you once you jump in, you're committed. You don't want to jump in, then a month later get out and then say, well, what was that for? So
no, absolutely. These are ambitious people. They put a lot of blood, sweat, tears, and treasure into this race. And so it's not so easy for them. Look at what's happened to Biden right now. I mean, the writing's on the wall. He's going to get massacred in the fall. And every Democrat under the sun is begging him to get out, and they still can't. He may, though. That may actually be a different scenario. And frankly, the campaigns were smart to try to negotiate other candidates getting out, because you had to be the non-Boebert to have a chance to win. So it was a worthwhile effort, but it's often very difficult to do. And we're seeing it in live time with Biden right now. Everyone, Pelosi, Schumer, even Obama are begging him to get out. And he may by this weekend, but that would be a very, very rare situation in American politics.
Yeah, and as we record this is Thursday, July 18th, and actually before we started recording this, there's a lot of kind of breaking news, Washington Post and some others headlines about President Biden. So, but if we'll see what happens there, we may have you back on to talk about however that plays out for sure. So CD8, I want to make sure I respect your time, Tyler. So let's jump into CD8, Gabe Evans, Janik Joshi. I found this one very interesting. I think this was the biggest margin of victory, maybe of any race in the entire state a couple weeks ago. Gabe Evans, state representative, Army helicopter pilot, former Arvada police officer, endorsed. I found this very interesting because he was endorsed by AFP, Americans for Prosperity, kind of early on, a few months back. And then he also got endorsed by President Trump, but he got endorsed by President Trump after the state party had went ahead and endorsed his opponent, Janik Joshi. I think I'm saying his name correctly. So I found that very interesting because Trump actually bucked what the Colorado State GOP was supporting there. So I'd love your thoughts on that one.
Yes, it's Janik Joshi, and
Joshi.
He was a carpetbagger. He used to represent a state house district down in Colorado Springs that now State Senator Larry Liston beat him in a primary in 2016. I was involved in an outside effort to help Larry Liston beat Janik Joshi, who lost his medical license for, I believe, killing a patient on the operating table. And so he was calling himself doctor in his ads and had a stethoscope and a white lab coat. He'd lost his medical license, so he was no longer a doctor. So he ran a fraudulent campaign from start to finish. He had just moved to Thornton in the district mere months, I believe, before he announced his candidacy. So he wasn't from there. It was a right-wing Dave Williams acolyte ploy, and voters responded accordingly with the largest margin in the state. I believe it was 55 points. Breb Kirkmeyer, State Senator Breb Kirkmeyer, was close. I think she had about a 50-point victory. But 55 points is very hard to come by. And State Party clearly is not in lockstep with Donald Trump because they are endorsing against his candidates. But I think Gabe Evans, that's going to be a very fascinating race in the general election, where Trump lost Colorado by 13.5 points in 2020. If he loses by less than 10 points this time around, which he's certainly on track to at this point, I don't know if he can win, but he certainly is going to be a lot closer of a race. I think Gabe Evans has a very good shot at picking up CD8, which is going to be a top 5 congressional race in the fall. We've already seen, I believe, about $13 million in TV reservations from Republicans and Democrats already reserved for the fall. So, hold on to your boots if you're in CD8. You're about to receive wall-to-wall advertising from probably early August onwards through November. So that's going to be... And it's a good thing because Gabe is a much more competitive candidate, a Hispanic veteran, police officer, a family man, helped homeschool his kids, a really thoughtful guy, an incredible messenger, beloved at the Capitol. I know folks at the state Capitol are sad to see him go because he's been such an effective communicator, but I think he's going to give Yadira Caraveo a real run for her money.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was Gabe's. I was the comms director for the caucus up there, and it was Gabe's first session. And I mean, the guy's like a rock star in person and then on paper as well. I mean, he's kind of everything you want. Like you said, he's I think maybe the only Hispanic Republican in the state House of Representatives, and he's running for a predominantly Hispanic district who has a current Democrat Hispanic representative. And then you add in, like you said, Army helicopter pilot, Arvetta police officer, family guy. I think he's a rancher too. When he's out of session, he's got his own like family ranch. So it's going to be very interesting to watch that one and see how that plays out. But like you said, I think it's probably going to be one of the top 5. It has to be one of the top 5 watched congressional races in the entire country.
Absolutely. He was the only Hispanic Republican, but is being replaced by another Hispanic Republican, Carlos Barron, who actually was born in Mexico, has spent 21 years in the oil and gas industry in Colorado. He'll be the first oil and gas worker in the legislature in modern history. So he's replaced by another really interesting guy. We'll see if he's got the communication chops of Gabe Evans, but he's certainly, I've met him, a really nice guy, really humble, smart guy. He's on the Fort Lupton City Council currently. So it's great to see the Republicans really moving beyond the kind of tired, pale male and stale kind of cookie cutter candidate we've had, a lot of old white dudes. So I'm glad to see younger folks running, people of color, women. I'm really glad to see, it's not a DEI, this is merit based, but I'm glad to see a Colorado Republican Party that looks like the electorate it seeks to represent.
Yeah, that's a good point. CD3, 6-way race. Jeff Hurd ended up winning it with 41%. Ron Hanks came in second with 28%. This was an interesting one because this was Boebert's, I guess you could say, current district that she represents, but obviously because she jumped into CD4, so that this opened the seat up. Traditionally a conservative district, and I'm sure still leans Republican, but Adam Frisch ran against Boebert 2 years ago. Adam Frisch came very, very close to beating Boebert, which could or could not be the reason that she decided to move to CD3. And so this was a very watched race. I believe Ron Hanks was the one endorsed by the state Republican Party. Ron Hanks is a very interesting character, very big on election conspiracy stuff from 2020. And I know very close friends with Dave Williams. So I'd love your take on how that race played out.
I think Republicans are breathing a huge sigh of relief on what happened there, because Ron Hanks would have been an unmitigated disaster, would have lost that seat and handed it to Adam Frisch, who has more money than God currently. He has millions and millions of dollars in the bank. I was banking on beating Lauren Boebert. Now he's lost that, and he has someone that's a much more mainstream, less controversial Republican in the model of Jeff Hurd, he's cooked. I mean, that's a R+9 district. So I think Adam is very sad. I think his fundraising consultants are sad too, because his fundraising has slowed down dramatically since Boebert left the district. People were not giving money across the country because they love Adam Frisch. They were giving it because of the lightning rod that was Lone Boebert. So his fundraising consultants probably already have an extra ski chalet in Aspen based on what they were charging him and making millions off of what they raised. But at this point, I think that race is a fait accompli. If Jeff can raise enough money, get his name ID out there, he's still not that well known. But a super PAC affiliated with U.S. House Speaker Mike Johnson came in and spent money against Ron Hanks because he was such a threat. They spent about $500,000 or so. But that was a good investment because it would have cost them tens of millions of dollars to bring the district back over the years if it was lost to Adam Frisch. Where I think with Jeff Hurd, they can be very confident that Jeff's going to carry this race in the fall. And it's also great news for state Senate races for Republicans that are running in overlapped areas, because Lauren was, frankly, a drag down ticket. That's gone. And so Cleve Simpson running in SD6, Mark Catlin running in SD5, seats where if we don't win both of them, the Democrats will get a supermajority in the Senate. So I think there's a lot of Republicans breathing a sigh of relief that we don't have a controversial, far-right nominee. We have a very mainstream nominee that I think is going to win pretty easily.
That's very interesting. Okay, I want to respect your time again. We're at 30 minutes. We're a little bit over. Just real quick, couple races here. Senate District 2, Lisa Frizzell versus Tim Arvidsson. Lisa won pretty handily, 2-1, 66% to roughly 34%. I know Lisa Frizzell personally. Again, she was a state legislator, still is a state legislator. So I worked with her up at the state capitol. Very well respected, very conservative. I would not consider her, as some people say, a moderate Republican versus Tim Arvidsson. She's very conservative, but I think, like we talked about earlier, the more kind of down to earth, rational, reasonable Republican that you can work with to get things done. I'd love to hear your take on it. I'm not familiar with Tim Arvidsson at all, and I didn't watch that race super closely, but I'd love to hear.
This is a great race where character counts. Tim Arvidsson had 5 DUIs, restraining orders, drug arrests, almost $400,000 in unpaid liens over the years. I mean, someone that was just reckless from start to finish, ran an angry campaign, and Lisa ran on a record of accomplishments. She helped lead the fight against Prop HH, helping defeat a $2 billion property tax hike. She helped pass legislation to help reduce property taxes. She's someone that ran a thoughtful, conservative, policy-oriented campaign, and Tim Arvidsson was an unmitigated disaster. One of the worst backgrounds I've ever seen, and I've worked in over 250 races in 24 states and half a dozen countries, and I've seen very few candidates that raise the level of awfulness of background that Tim Arvidsson had. So I think that was a real question of character. Same thing in HD 65, which is actually the most conservative district in the state, up in Welby, kind of like little west of Greeley, Weld County. That was another race where self-proclaimed MAGA king Trent Lacey was running against Lori Garcia Sander, and he had serious domestic violence issues. He had unpaid tax issues. Again, it was a character question. Lori was a longtime principal and teacher, a thoughtful person backed by Sheriff Steve Reams, very popular sheriff up in Weld County, backed by a who's who of conservative leaders, and then MAGA king Trent Lacey, who got shellacked as well. And voters rejected people of poor character. We don't want lawbreakers to be lawmakers. And so people with serious criminal arrest records were thoroughly rejected.
Yeah, so I'm not very familiar with Trent Lacey other than some of the news articles and stuff I saw. Did he run for a different office or something?
He was running for CD4, and when then Trump didn't endorse him, he jumped in HD 65. He's currently a Weld County Council member, but he got that via vacancy appointment. He's never actually won an election, because when voters see him and hear about what he's about and see his background, they reject him thoroughly. I mean, that was a serious drubbing up there. But those two races, to me, were the character counts questions, because both Trent Lacey and Tim Arvidsson had very serious criminal arrest records, very serious financial impropriety, and just it come down to a question of character. Lori Garcia Sander and Lisa Frizzell are great, strong, conservative women, and Trent and Tim are embarrassments.
Interesting. State Board of Education, which is something we don't talk about a whole lot as far as the actual positions themselves. Christy Burton Brown, who's a friend of the show, she's been on the show before. Again, I should say this. I don't know if I said it in the beginning, but we are a nonpartisan nonprofit, so we don't endorse or take sides or spend money or anything like that. But Christy has been on the show before, and she won a much closer race, 53% 46.45% to 46.55%. She was running against Sandra Larson. Now, the reason I say that this is an interesting one because of what the state GOP did with endorsing candidates and things like that. Christy Burton Brown was the state party chair before Dave Williams. Dave Williams has made a lot of allegations against Christy Burton Brown about her time as chair, accused her of misallocating money and corruption and fraud. I don't know.
Projecting is what he's doing.
What's that?
Projecting. She had no problems whatsoever. She was a stellar chair, not an ounce of dirt on her in terms of her ethics or her financial management of state party. Dave was simply projecting there, and it was garbage because she won top line at assembly and state party endorsed her opponent, but she really lacked the resources. She didn't have a whole lot of money, so that's why I think that race came down to being closer because voters don't generally pay a whole lot of attention to the State Board of Education. Of voters in a primary, I would guess no more than 20-25% are parents with kids in school, so 75-80% do not have skin in the game, so they're not tracking the issues that much. But Christy Burton Brown, full disclosure, I was a max out donor to her. I'm a big supporter. I think she's very thoughtful, a great communicator, a great champion for school choice, and I'm really glad that she's going to be on the State Board of Education, being that voice for families. Because right now, we're losing Stephen Varela, and so until Christy comes in, there'll be no one on all. There's 9 board of directors for the State Board of Education. Other than Varela, none of them have kids in school. So you have 9 people making decisions for almost 1 million school children and their families, and none of them have kids in school. So Christy, being a parent of young children, will bring a very important missing voice to the State Board of Education. And I'm hoping there was no primary here, but CD8 has a Board of Ed race in the fall. It's going to be very competitive. Yasmin Navarro is also a parent, and I think would be a great parent voice for school choice and for respecting parents as important stakeholders in the process of education. So I'm very excited to see Christy win that race. It was closer, I think. It's a very large district. I mean, a congressional district is 800,000 residents, and she was capped at taking no more than $450. So she has a hard time raising enough money to communicate with an audience that big.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, Tyler, last one, State Senate District 28, and that is this is for the Democrat primary, Mike Weissman versus Idris Keith. This was actually a pretty close race, 53% to 47%. Mike Weissman won. So I know Mike Weissman vaguely just from my time at the Capitol. He was a state representative there. I know his wife, I believe, was the former chairwoman of the Democrat Party in Colorado. I personally had never heard of Idris Keith, which made it a little surprising to me that it was such a close race because I know Mike Weissman is pretty well known in circles. So I'd love to hear your take on that one.
I think it was the most expensive race on the Democratic side, and what I understand from my Democratic friends is it was a question of turnout. Turnout was too low to help get Idris Keith across the finish line. Weissman being a quasi-incumbent, a member of leadership in the House, a Democratic representative, he used his name ID, and then a lot of left-wing groups, like socialist groups, and trial lawyers, which he's been essentially the pony they've ridden at the Capitol for years. He carries all their bills, does their bidding to help the trial lawyers more money. The business community was not a fan of that because he's been just a left-wing, very, very far left legislator. I think the business community and a lot of moderate Democrats were tired of that and ponied up big to try to beat him with Idris Keith, who's a Pinnacle Assurance attorney, an African-American. And it's actually the most diverse district in the state. It's the most African-American, and overall, across all minority groups, the most diverse. And so there was real hope that an African-American man against a white liberal would be a powerful contrast. And Idris had a great record. Problem is, the turnout was too low. And I think a lot of the communities of color did not turn out at the numbers they needed to get Idris across. And late money, a couple $100,000 in union and socialist money, came in for Weissman. So I'm sad to see Weissman ascending to the Senate. It's too bad, but I'm glad that Hernandez and Epps will no longer be at the Capitol. So I think overall it was a great night. I think you had, Dave Williams going down and Tim Hernandez going down. That's great for humanity. That's great for Colorado. It's about time that the pendulum come back to the middle. Because Colorado is not a far left state. We're not a far right state. We're a state that's much more in the middle. We want a small government, a thoughtful government, and we want people to be able to live their lives. Whether they work in the oil and gas industry or they're gay, we want people to have liberty here and have a chance at the American dream. And the far left and the far right are too busy screaming about their own issues and not focusing on solving problems. So I think Weissman is a sad kind of exception to the rule that dominated election night, which was that extremists lost and mainstream, not moderates, but mainstream folks prevailed in almost every single race and by large margins.
Very interesting. Well, listen, Tyler, I appreciate it again. Thank you for joining us on this issue. just I want to reiterate one more time, we are a nonpartisan nonprofit, so we're just covering the election here and getting an expert's take on it. And so I don't want that to be confused with the Engage the Rockies taking any position on any of these races. But, I really appreciate your analysis of it. I know you live and breathe this stuff, and it's literally your job. And so, we appreciate it very much. And we hope to have you back on maybe after the November election and see how that turned out, because that's going to be very
hopefully as well as the primary. I think it's about time the pendulum comes back in general as well. So thanks for your time, and thanks for educating your audience on these issues.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Tyler. We'll see you soon.
Thank you for listening to the Engage the Rockies podcast, your go-to podcast for local and state issues concerning Colorado.